football bowl division schools. In 2009, the graduation rate of Joe Paterno's players was 89%, and the graduation success rate was 85%, both of which were the greatest among all football programs in the final 2009 Associated Press Top 25 poll. Now, pleased to yield back to my good friend, Mr. Dent.
Yeah, thank you. And as we wind down this special order this hour to talk about Joe Paterno, we should also probably note one other thing, too. Of course, Joe Paterno was about success with honor. He was about making an impact. He was also about family. And I also just want to say that, too, that many players over the years, their children would come, in some cases 3 generations, had played with him. It's just a remarkable story. I think of a guy from my hometown, Mike Gooman. Many of my colleagues from Arizona will remember Mike Gooman for the famous goal line stand, Penn State, Alabama, Sugar Bowl, 1979. Now, I wish the result had been different, but nevertheless, Mike Gooman was a running back, and had so many kind, wonderful things to say about him. His son, too, Andrew Gooman, played at Penn State, and that was just the kind of program that I think Joe wanted. It was very family-oriented. And also wanted to mention, too, that one of the eulogies about Joe that is probably worth sharing, I believe was given by his son, Jay. They often talked about his sense of humor and that of his wife. But Joe was apparently utterly, as was Sue, they were utterly devoted to each other, very independent-minded people, but very much dependent upon one another. And I'm just going to read an excerpt from that eulogy. Humor was a large part of my parents' marriage. My mom and dad speaking together was always entertaining. My mom would jump up with a smart comment when he was talking, and you get a glimpse of how the two of them interacted. Neither one of them took themselves too seriously. And he says one of my favorite lines they had was about how they stayed married so long. They had a deal. Whoever leaves the marriage first had to take the children, so neither one of them ever left. I mean, that was sort of the sense of humor they had, but they were so utterly devoted to each other, to their 5 children and to their many grandchildren. And that's something we don't know. We don't speak much about Joe Paterno. He didn't have a whole lot of hobbies either. He was devoted to family and his football program and to the university. That's what he was about. And so it really speaks volumes about him. He will be deeply missed. And at this time, I would, I guess, yield to the gentleman from Altoona, or Mr. Schuster.
Thank the gentleman from Allentown for yielding. It's a great privilege for me to be here on the House floor today talking about someone who I have the highest regard for, and over the years was able to watch just what a tremendous thing he did at the University of Penn State University. And it's not just about winning football games. Of course, he won 409 games in his 46 seasons, 5 undefeated teams, and led Penn State to 2 national championships. But he did more than that. Did more for the university. I know my colleagues have already talked about he's the only Division I school in the country that has a wing of the library named after the head football coach. That's because of his and Sue's dedication and contributions to building that, not only that library, but that institution. And a lot of that building came through as he built those football teams and brought national attention to Penn State. But for me, personal level, probably one of the proudest moments I had was to stand on the House floor when I believe he surpassed Walter Camp's winning record of 309 victories, I think it was, about 10 years ago. And John Peterson, the congressman from state who represented that part of the country at that time, who GT's replaced or followed, we had a special order on the floor, and John Peterson started first, and then the great coach Tom Osborne, which I don't know if many people know it, but Tom Osborne served in Congress in the early 2000s, and so Tom Osborne then got up and talked about Joe Paterno and his respect for him. So then I got to follow Tom Osborne. I'm following a legendary football coach talking about a legendary football coach, which really, it's even to this day, I'm getting goosebumps remembering that time, because it was really an exciting and a moment that I'll always remember. But again, what Joe Paterno did that stood apart from many other coaches was his dedication to education and academic excellence. Unlike many other schools with Division I programs, Paterno recruited players speaking first about Penn State's academic excellence. And during that time in the early 2000s when I served with Coach Tom Osborne, those were lean years for Penn State and for Joe Paterno. And when we'd come to town on a Monday or Tuesday night for votes, Coach Osborne would summon me over on the floor and talk to me about what was going on in central Pennsylvania, how was the media treating Joe. And there was a real concern that Coach Osborne had for Joe Paterno, and a real respect came through. So after several of these meetings, I finally asked Coach Osborne, I said, it's obvious you have this great respect for Joe Paterno. Is that because you thought he was a superior coach to you? And he said, oh, no, absolutely not. I have a higher winning percentage than Paterno. But he said, I do have a great respect for Joe because Joe could do something that nobody ever was able to achieve. And that is year in and year out, Joe Paterno would graduate roughly 85% of his players, but always the highest graduation rate in Division I. And on top of that, he had quality football teams, and he recruited quality players, and he could compete at a national level. So he said, that's something none of us could do. And then he went on, Coach Osborne went on to tell me about how he would talk to Joe in the off-season and try to understand the programs and the discipline and the things he did because he wanted to be able to get to that level with Joe. And Coach Osborne told me, I believe, was the highest he ever got was 79% graduation rate. So, you know, that's what one of the great all-time coaches, that's the great respect he held for Joe Paterno. And again, it was not just about his football, but it was about what he was, about building young men, about instilling in them the need to educate themselves and to be excellent when it came to their academic efforts. He often said, you have to start with the idea that a kid has to be a student first. And Paterno said in the 1982 Gannett News Service interview, we preach there are three things in a student's life when it comes to Penn State: studies, athletics, and social life. And you must keep them in that order, or you can never back away from that. So again, Joe Paterno, education first mindset, paid off for those thousands of young men that came to Penn State. And I don't know if you've watched the ceremony, dedication to his life and his funeral, but you saw that come clear through, not just from superstars, but from kids that couldn't even play after a couple of years because of injury. But Joe Paterno stuck with them, encouraged them, and instilled in them the importance of academics in their life and making sure they get that education. Because as we know full well, that when kids go off to play Division I sports, whether it's football, it's basketball, it's baseball, they don't always, and 99% of them never make it to the pro level. But they got an opportunity to go to college, and at places like Penn State and other universities, when you have coaches like Joe Paterno and coaches that aspire to be like Joe Paterno, they instill in those kids that those 99% that can't make it big in the pros, they still can get an education, they still can graduate from college and go out and get a good job and provide for their families and become productive citizens. And again, that's something that Joe Paterno always preached, to be productive, to be a good citizen, to give back to your community. And he lived that life, and he will be sorely missed, not only in Central and in Pennsylvania, but I believe throughout the college ranks throughout the nation. And he'll be one of those people you can look to and say, that's the kind of coach I want to be, that's the kind of program I want to build, and those are the kind of kids that I want to turn into young, productive citizens in the United States of America. So again, pleased to be here with my colleagues from Allentown and Bellefonte? Close to Bellefonte. That's even smaller. And I'm actually from Everett, Charlie, so Altoona is a big city to me. I don't even know my way around Altoona. But again, thanks a lot for you guys for doing this. I appreciate it greatly, and I yield back.
I have to apologize for making that error. I knew you're from Everett, not from Altoona, but Blair County, the whole of Bedford, it's a wonderful area. We love it. But just wanted to say one other thing, too, that my friend Mr. Schuster just reminded me of about how Coach Paterno, Joe Paterno, recognized that most of his players were not going to become pros. And he celebrated the accomplishments of his players off the field. In fact, I remember one fellow who went to school with me, a guy named Stuart McMunn. I think he was captain of the special teams. They won the national title the year after I graduated, and he was, you know, and he talked with pride about that young man. You know, he's not going to be a pro, but he's got all this spirit, all this fight in him. He's a smart kid and all that. And you know, he's a dentist. He became a dentist. and he was very proud of the fact that, that was one of his players. And that was kind of the way he was. He wanted to see his players succeed. He wasn't so concerned about the next 5 years after graduation, but the next, 15, 20, 30, 50 years to see what they're doing with their lives. And so I think that's something we shouldn't lose sight of. And I did read from a eulogy given at the celebration of Joe's life by one of his children. I would like to submit this for the record. And I appreciate that. And again, I just wanted to conclude by saying that Joe Vincent Paterno, a great Pennsylvanian, a great American, a strong leader, a mentor to so many, a mentor even to many people who never met him, but who had an impact on their lives. So, Joe Paterno, yes, you did in fact make an impact. I yield back to Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Dent. Mr. Speaker, Joe Paterno claimed that the long-run measure of the success of his teams was in the contributions his players made to society after graduation. Joe Paterno decided not to accept the lucrative NFL coaching offers because he loved being an educator as a college coach. He also criticized the NFL teams that took too much of his players' time during their senior years. Paterno pushed the NCAA to adopt rules requiring higher levels of academic performance from college athletes, pushing higher standards from both high school and college athletes. Paterno's dedication to education extended far beyond the players he coached. In the early 1980s, he pushed Penn State leadership to expand fundraising from alumni in order to advance academic programs. Paterno and his wife donated several $1 million to Penn State University, and he helped them raise many millions more. Coach Paterno once said, "When I'm gone, I hope they write I made Penn State a better place, not just that I was a good football coach." Well, Coach, that is what they're writing today. He envisioned that increasing the resources available to the university through fundraising would help its students to attain academic excellence. And the great things that Penn State has attained over the years are in part a testament to his vision and his dedication to that cause. Often universities name athletic facilities after great coaches. Penn State named a new wing of its library after Paterno. Paterno's contributions extend beyond Penn State. He was heavily involved, he and his wife Sue, in the Special Olympics, and was also a national spokesperson for the Charcot-Marie Tooth Foundation. Mr. Speaker, just yesterday I had the opportunity to visit with one of the Special Olympic athletes, an ambassador for that program from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Chris Jaliski. And the first thing that Chris did in coming to my office was to express his sorrows for the loss of Coach Joe Paterno. Paterno wrote that he had been strongly influenced by this line from St. Ignatius: "Always work as though everything depended on you, yet always pray knowing that everything depends on God." Over the years, that dynamite thought has exploded to something larger and larger in my life. It means to me now, never be afraid to accept your own limitations or the limitations of others. Accept that we're all pretty small potatoes, yet always know how great each of us can be. So the winningest coach in college football history, I think, was among the most humble of men, based on those remarks that he made. The enormous positive impact that Joe Paterno has made on thousands of players, hundreds of thousands of students, and millions of fans and admirers across central Pennsylvania and around the world cannot be understated. He was a man, but his legend continues. For combining humility with a dedication to greatness, Joe Paterno stands as a model for all of us. With the passing of Joe Paterno, we are all Penn State, and we mourn his loss. Thank you, Joe Paterno. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time.
If I ever close with your...
I'm going to get Tom.
left because Ellison's here.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5th, 2011, the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ellison, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, allow me to claim the hour on behalf of the Minority Leader, and I got some boards to put up, so I'm going to take a moment to do that. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate the time today. A lot of important issues facing the American people, none more important than their economic livelihood and viability. And so we're going to be talking today during this special order about economic justice, economic opportunity, and the fight for the American middle class. Mr. Speaker, I'm co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. The Congressional Progressive Caucus is that caucus that comes to Congress to band together to stand up for the American dream. The idea that all Americans, no matter which color they may be, whether they're disabled or not, whether they're straight or gay or what their religion is, have a right to full participation and opportunity to grab that American dream is one of our core beliefs. The Progressive Caucus believes in a clean air, clean environment, believes that all Americans, all people across the world have the right to clean air, clean water, and food free of pesticides and toxics. The Progressive Caucus is the organization that is foursquare for civil rights for all people. But we believe that it is a national disgrace that women are paid 80 cents for every dollar a man makes. We think it's a national disgrace that you not be able to marry whoever you love and want to be with. We think it's a national problem that people in our society, which is founded on the idea of religious tolerance, sometimes find themselves the target of religious hate and hysteria. And we are foursquare dedicated to the idea that peace should be the guiding principle of our nation, and diplomacy and development are good things, and that a war is almost always a bad thing, though sometimes necessary. Diplomacy is always better before we send our young people into harm's way. That's who the Progressive Caucus is. That's what we're about. And I'm going to offer tonight, Mr. Speaker, a progressive message. Oh, having trouble, Mr. Speaker. Technical difficulty. A progressive message. And so let me begin with that progressive message. We're here to talk about the progressive message on this day, February 9th, to address the issue of economic viability. Working American families are getting crushed under our middle class is shrinking every day. But here in Washington, our friends on the other side of the aisle, the Republican caucus, is in control of the House. And while millions of people are facing foreclosure and unemployment, sadly, we see Americans continuing to hurt, and their problems are not being addressed. This week in Congress, if I can just talk about what we did this week, the Republican majority did not bring up a single jobs bill. We didn't talk about jobs this week. Here we are at the close of the week, and we're not talking about jobs. They did bring up a bill to keep they did not bring up a bill to keep Americans in their homes and address foreclosure, nor did we talk about cleaning up our air and our water or rebuilding our economy or our nation's crumbling infrastructure. No. We weren't doing that. We were doing something else. Had to do with scoring points in an election. But one of the things we did today, which I think was important, but which was an idea that came from the Democratic majority Senate and originated with great Democrats Tim Walz and Louise Slaughter, is that we voted on a bill to stop trading on congressional knowledge, the Stock Act. Today, we voted on a bill designed to stop members of a Congress from profiting from confidential information they receive while doing their jobs. You would think that this goes without saying, but sadly, that's exactly what some politicians have been doing. We voted on the STOP Act today, the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act, and I was happy to support this bill because my colleagues, Louise Slaughter and Tim Walz, pushing a bill, which I think was a better version, but we voted on the Senate version today. But the price for getting that bill in front of us today, the price for fighting to get that bill in front of us, was a carve-out for Wall Street special interests. That's too bad. The bill came before us today, and I voted for it, but the public should know a few things about the legislation. Only after stripping out a provision to stop the so-called political intelligence would the majority even consider voting to stop members from making bets on confidential information. We wonder why Congress has a 10% approval rating. After months of calls for action by House Democrats, House Republicans have finally relented, and the House took up the STOC Act today, clarifying that members of Congress and congressional staff and executive branch officials and judicial officers are subject to the same insider trading rules as everyone else. Unfortunately, leadership in the majority House caucus took transparency and accountability measure and rewrote it in secret in the dark of night. And the majority caucus, the Republican caucus, weakened the bill, dropping a provision that will require those who peddled political intelligence for profit to register and report the eliminating and the anti-corrupting provision added by the Senate and unanimously approved by the House Judiciary Committee in December. Regarding the political intelligence provisions, Senator Grassley, Republican of Iowa, responded, "It's astonishing and extremely disappointing that the House would fulfill Wall Street's wishes by killing this provision." So Republican Senator Grassley even had to admonish the House to say, why would we weaken the bill, dropping a provision that would require those who peddle political intelligence for money to register and report their activities? That's too bad. If Congress delays action, the political intelligence industry will stay in the shadows, just the way Wall Street likes it. It's time to act on this legislation and take a first step toward restoring trust in government. We must hold a swift House-Senate conference to strengthen this Republican majority bill that passed through here that's a weakened piece of legislation. Last week, the Senate bill passed a stronger measure by a vote of 96-3, and the stronger bipartisan House bill is co-sponsored by 285 members, including 99 Republicans. The so-called political intelligence industry serves no one. All it does is really pad Wall Street profits off of a rigged game. This insider trading is nothing more than Wall Street insiders pumping Washington insiders for information so that they can place bets on stocks. Political intelligence firms have grown drastically over the last few decades and are now a $100 million industry. Every day these firms help hedge funds and Wall Street investors unfairly profit from non-public congressional information, and these firms have no oversight and can freely pass along information for investment purposes. A 2005 story on insiders profiting off of a last-minute government bailout of companies embroiled in an asbestos litigation was a catalyst to the STOC Act. A recent Wall Street Journal story on the prevalence of the industry, the intelligence industry, reinforces the need for this bill. Without the STOC Act, enforcement officials are left in the dark on who is paying and playing in the political intelligence industry. This is why we need the whole STOC Act. The Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act, the STOC Act, would shed necessary light on lucrative industry that has been lurking in the shadows since the 70s. H.R. 1148 establishes regulation for political intelligence industry by amending the Lobbying Disclosure Act to apply the registration, reporting, and disclosure requirements to all political intelligence activities just as they apply to lobbyists now. It's important, this is important provision, and it's an essential piece to the STOC Act's purpose of banning insider trading, based on congressional knowledge. Support for the Stock Act. Support for the Stock Act. The Stock Act has a lot of support, Mr. Speaker. The Stock Act has a broad base of support from organizations dedicated to government reform, including Public Citizen, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, Common Cause, Democracy 21, League of Women Voters, Project on Government Oversight, and the Sunlight Foundation and U.S. PIRG. Here's a summary of the Stock Act, and this is the bill authored by Tim Walz and Louise Slaughter, of which I'm an original co-sponsor. It's a stronger version than what came through here today, and it's what our country needs. The Stock Act requires firms that specialize in political intelligence who use information obtained from Congress to advise financial transactions to register with the House and Senate, just like lobbying firms are required to do. It prohibits members, their staff, executive branch employees, and any other person from buying or selling securities, swaps, or commodity futures based on congressional and executive branch non-public information. It requires a more timely disclosure of financial transactions above $1,000 for those members and staff that are already required to file annual financial disclosures. And it amends the House ethics rules to prohibit members and their employees from disclosing any non-public information about legislative action for investment purposes. My constituents don't have insider traders looking out for their bottom line. Now, let me just talk a little bit more about this Stock Act. While the House voted this morning on the Stock Act, making clear that rules against insider trading apply to members of Congress, congressional staff, executive branch officials, and judicial officers and employees, the version brought to the floor by Leader Cantor was weakened by Republicans before it actually became to be voted on. The GOP rhetoric suggesting otherwise isn't fooling anybody. The Associated Press weighed in on this issue, and they said the House passes Republican-written insider trading bill that was heavy Wall Street influence. The House has passed a bill to ban members of Congress and executive branch officials from insider trading, but critics from both parties accuse House Republican leaders of caving in to investment firms by eliminating a proposal to regulate people who try to pry financial information from Congress. The New York Times had something to say, too. Here's what they said in an editorial. The House less persuasive ban on insider trading. House Republican leaders appear ready to bow to electioneer pressure and pass a bill banning lawmakers from using non-public information they hear on the job to make financial investments. The House legislation, however, is missing two vital provisions that are in the Senate bill that won overwhelming approval last week. If the goal is to root out corruption and raise the public's low opinion of Congress, the House should approve the full range of reform in the Senate bill. The Washington Post also had something to say about this, Mr. Speaker. What they had to say is the House should take the opportunity to crack down on public corruption. The House of Representatives is expected to take up Thursday a useful measure to prohibit insider trading by members of Congress and to beef up disclosure of lawmakers' financial transactions. Unfortunately, the version of the measure produced by the House Majority Leader Eric Cantor omits one of the most important parts of the bill passed by the Senate, a provision that would restore prosecutors' ability to go after official corruption. So Politico, which is one of our local papers that talks about Congress, took up this issue and writes, Cantor under fire over Stock Act. What the Politico writes is this, Mr. Speaker. House Majority Leader Eric Cantor, Republican Virginia, has released his version of a congressional insider trading ban, and it strips a provision that would require so-called political intelligence consultants to disclose their activities like lobbyists already do. It also scraps a proposal that empowers federal prosecutors for going after corruption by public officials. That stoked backlash from Democrats, yes it did, and even some Republicans who are furious at Cantor and are accusing the Virginia Republican of watering down the popular legislation that easily passed the Senate last week. It's astonishing, this is a quote from the Politico article, it's astonishing and extremely disappointing that the House would fulfill Wall Street's wishes by killing the provision. That's what Senator Chuck Grassley said in a statement. If Congress delays action, the political intelligence industry will stay in the shadows just the way Wall Street likes it. Of course, Mr. Speaker, roll call had to weigh in on this issue as well. It sounds like there's a pretty strong consensus that the House version we passed was weakened and watered down and not what the public was expecting. Roll call says, Grassley, others rip House Stock Act. Senator Chuck Grassley is ripping the House version of a major reform bill passed late Tuesday, calling it, quote, astonishing, unquote, that House GOP leaders would drop a provision requiring political intelligence consultants to register as lobbyists. Senator Grassley joined a chorus of watchdog groups and Democrats criticizing the House version. Melanie Sloan, president of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, said the Cantor provision is a sham and aimed at tricking Americans into thinking he's dealing with the issue. That was a quote. And so whether you're talking about Politico, Washington Times, Washington Post, Associated Press, roll call, or whether you're just talking about members of the House Democratic Caucus or citizens across the nation, we did pass a version of the Stock Act today. It was a weakened version. It wasn't good enough. And, Mr. Speaker, if Americans across this country decided that they were going to demand that there be a conference committee in which the stronger provisions were adopted, I think that would be a very good thing. Americans across this country, I think they agree with what's written in this Washington Post article. They write, a scaled-back ethics bill headed toward likely passage on the House Thursday despite complaints from senators that Republican leaders are jettisoning, that means getting rid of, several key provisions that won overwhelming support in the Senate last week. And, of course, Think Progress probably echoes the sentiments of the American people, too, Mr. Speaker, as they write in their blog, House Republicans prepare to vote on watered-down congressional insider trading ban. Here's what they say. Since a 60 Minutes report showed that Representative Spencer Baucus, Republican, Alabama, profited from information he obtained in a private economic briefing in 2008, Congress has moved quickly to pass a bill to ban insider trading by its members. House Majority Leader Eric Cantor has made several changes to the legislation which appear intended to at least weaken the final product, if not kill it outright. That is what they said at Think Progress. Of course, the New York Times, they're in this too. This is an issue of serious public concern, and we would expect their editorial writers to weigh in. And what they said was this, Mr. Speaker. With the House poised to take up a major ethics bill, Republican leaders have deleted a provision that would for the first time regulate the collection of political intelligence from political insiders for the use of hedge funds, mutual funds, and other investors. Representative Louise Slaughter, Democrat of New York, said lawmakers and the public needed to know more about the activities of these professionals who, she said, quote, glean information from members of Congress and staff and sell it to clients who make a lot of money off of it. You know, Mr. Speaker, I'm betting that a lot of people across America don't even know that this practice even takes place. I'm betting that a lot of people across America don't realize that there are people who sort of scurry around in the shadows looking for tidbits of information which they could use to make an investment decision, and that these people, this is a multi-million-dollar industry. I would like to pause for a moment, Mr. Speaker, and say if Representative Marcy Kaptur, okay, all right, let me know when you're ready. When you're ready, you let me know. But let me also move back and just say that, Mr. Speaker, I doubt that the American people really realize that there is important information that can affect stock price that is thrown around here. And you would think that it would be just common sense, Mr. Speaker, that as we as members of Congress are hired to pursue the public interest, that no one would ever use that information to advance their private commercial interests. There's nothing wrong with members of Congress owning a business or something like that. I mean, this is America. But to say you're going to Congress to get information to try to trade stocks and then getting rich off that information seems to me a real problem. Now, I don't know what the facts are. All I know is what I saw in 60 Minutes. But it was alleged that a member of Congress was in a meeting pursuing his responsibility to promote the public interest, left that meeting using information from that meeting and purchased stock options and basically made a bet that the economy would go down. So I ask you, Mr. Speaker, can a person charged with a public duty and to uphold the public interest simultaneously pursue their private interests? And what happens, Mr. Speaker, when those two things are at odds? If your job is to keep the economy afloat, but it would make you money if the economy goes down because you have essentially bought stock options where you would financially gain from the loss of value, what is one to do? Well, if they're a public service employee, if they're a public official, they should pursue the public interest, and the law should forbid them from trying to pursue their private interests at the public expense. And yet, we do know that these things, that there's good evidence that these things may well have happened, and that there needs to be accountability all around. And it is disappointing that when we finally, after these things, finally get to the point where we're going to pass a bill, that we don't go all the way. We make carve-outs for political intelligence industry. We make carve-outs for people here and there. This is not right. The Senate version, which has accountability, which has prosecution authority, and which bans this political intelligence industry from just operating in the shadows, that is what we should be doing, not making carve-outs for them and sweetheart deals. So I'm joined now by my good friend from the great state of Ohio, representing the Northern Ohio area. There's really no one, Mr. Speaker, who has been a greater advocate for consumers than Marcy Kaptur. Marcy, I yield the floor to you.
I thank my dear colleague from Minnesota, and thank you for your leadership on so many issues here. I've listened with care to what you've been presenting today to give voice to the American people from coast to coast. And I want to thank you in particular for the work you've done on mortgage foreclosures, on holding Wall Street accountable, Congressman Ellison. No one has fought harder. Minnesota's been affected. Your home city of Detroit, all across northern Ohio, Toledo, to Sandusky, to Lorain, to Cleveland, Parma, all these communities so struck so hard by Wall Street's malfeasance. And I wanted to join you today as you keep a focus on who the wrongdoers really have been and how we help the Republic heal, to thank the Obama administration for the efforts they've made to date on a major settlement that's being announced during the same time frame as we speak here. Where individual states and 5 of the major Wall Street banks who are responsible, who used a widespread fraudulent paperwork that precipitated the foreclosure crisis, this settlement will actually bring some measure of justice, and we ought to claim a great deal of credit because the Progressive Caucus has been working so hard on this, and housing and the mortgage foreclosure crisis has been at the top of our agenda. The settlement, the initial settlement, will reportedly impose a $26 billion penalty against Wells Fargo, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, Ally Financial, and Citigroup that were at the heart of the schemes that led to the securitization and collateralized debt obligation risk-taking. The total amount could grow to $30 billion or $45 billion if additional banks join the settlement. Given the extent of the damage they've caused, it's a start and, frankly, a very important one. We can't forget that millions of America's families lost their homes, and countless more are still dealing with foreclosure, and our cities have empty hulks of neighborhoods that are struggling as a result. If you come to places that I represent, as you've mentioned, in northern Ohio, you can see the thousands of vacant structures that these banks left to decay. They didn't even manage them well. once they possess them in neighborhood after neighborhood. The damage these banks inflicted is incalculable as they achieve the largest transfer of equity and wealth from Wall Street to Main Street. They've made every community more poor. This agreement is the largest joint federal-state settlement ever obtained and the result of unprecedented coordination between the various corners of our government and the states. And it needs to be a major settlement. 1 in 5 American families with a mortgage today, this is an astounding number, owe more than the house is actually worth, by an average of over $50,000. The collective negative equity across the nation is over $700 billion. For years I've come to this floor urging Congress to do more, and one critical part of this agreement is that it does not provide blanket immunity to the banks for their misdeeds. While the ink is barely dry in this agreement, the press is reporting, and I quote, officials will also be able to pursue any allegations of criminal wrongdoing. And I know the Congressman and I want to go down that road, and I wish to place in the record an article from the New York Times this week that talks about how African-American New Yorkers making more than $68,000 are nearly 5 times as likely to hold high-interest mortgages as Caucasians of similar income. I think the civil rights aspect of what has gone on, thank you very much, is extraordinarily important. I don't want to overstep my time boundaries here, Congressman Ellison. Do I have a couple extra minutes in this period or not?
Well, yes, you do, but may I ask you a question before you continue on?
Please.
You know, we may see as many as 10 million homes go into foreclosure and from the beginning of this crisis to the end. You know, how important to the average homeowner is this settlement? Is it going to help them? I yield back to the gentleman.
I think what's going to happen with this is, even though over 1 million homeowners are likely to be helped and several hundred thousand get some recompense, maybe an average of $2,000 per household, what's going to happen is it's going to precipitate more foreclosures as the system continues to progress. And that is a deep concern of mine, because these banks have not been noted for treating customers well. And according to the Justice Department, however, the agreement does not prevent any claims by individual borrowers who wish to bring their own lawsuits. And I think it's incumbent upon lawyers across this country, our Progressive Caucus, to look for legal remedies to continue to gain sweet justice for those who have been so harmed.
Can I ask the gentlelady to yield again? Now here's the other thing. I mean, so we know that there may be 10 people lost their home in foreclosure. Maybe 1 million will get help. That's good. Hope they get it. But has anybody gone to prison for for mortgage fraud schemes? I mean, here's why I want you to address this question, but let me lay it out just a tad for you. So what we have here, we know, is that people were drawn in with high-pressure tactics to get in a mortgage that they didn't understand, and sometimes were even misstated the income. There are people who would say, look, I didn't borrow that much money, I had no idea where that amount came from, and then there was a bunch of signing stuff that happened that people were not aware of, and that sort of skirted the reality.
If the gentleman would yield, the robo-signing.
The robo-signing.
Robo-signing.
That's right. And then another kind of amazing thing would happen is that people would underwrite mortgages, not based on the ability of the borrower to pay, but based on their ability to sell that mortgage into the secondary market. And then it would get repackaged into a mortgage-backed security, which somehow miraculously, you know, these things that were stated income, no job loans, falsified income for these things, made it into a mortgage-backed security, which then was rated as AAA in many cases. There's got to be some fraud and misrepresentation there. I mean, and so, I mean, it just seems like the system was full of misrepresentation, fraud, and all that. Have we investigated this thing to the point where there's people to hold accountable before we're settling this case?
Well, you know what's important to point out? You asked the critical question, because this settlement does not deal with those that originated mortgages. It only deals with those mortgages that were held in the secondary market.
Right.
And so it doesn't claw back to the perpetrators of the scheme. And that's why I'm saying this is an important first step. We also need, in every city, as we had during the savings and loan crisis, strike forces of FBI agents.
Right.
There were maybe 55 agents working on this. We tried to boost that number to 200. During the S&L crisis, we had 1,000. We need accounting and forensic experts to piece together what happened in community after community, Congressman. In my area, there were liars' loans that were targeted to senior citizens and the disabled. Liars' loans. They would go up to a senior citizen, a woman, after she lost her husband, and they would say, ma'am, you know, we feel very sorry for you, but we want you to know we have a deal. You'll never have to worry about your financial future again. And they got her to cash out her equity, and they put one of these balloon payments on there, so she ended up having to pay more than she could afford 10 years out. This is what happened to people. There's so much crime inside of what was done in community after community, and what's been happening at the FBI is they have not been able to beef up their financial fraud division. And they've been held. That's why
now,
you haven't had the people arrested.
If the gentlelady will yield for just a moment on this,
to the gentleman.
I want to ask you a question about that. So over the course of the last several months, our friends on the Republican side of the aisle, I'm just being honest, and I don't think even they would disagree with this, have been trumpeting this idea the government's too big, we got to cut, we just have to cut, just cut, scale it back, shrink it down, make it smaller, get rid of government. One iconic conservative figure said we got to shrink government to the size where you can drown it in a bathtub. Now, if we were to shrink government to the size where we can drown it in a bathtub, where are we going to get these lawyers and FBI agents to investigate mortgage fraud?
There will be no justice. There will be no justice. The Congressman has pointed out something extraordinarily important. There are those who seek to harm the American people, whether it's through financial crimes or those who are true enemies of our republic, and we have to be strong on all fronts. And in this arena of prosecution, we have been very weak.
I mean, have we even really investigated the extent of the wrongdoing before we settled the case? I mean, I'm glad there's been a settlement. I hope that it brings justice to everyone. I suspect it'll bring justice to some people. I hope so. But my question is, do we know the extent of the harm that bad actors, and here's the thing, the originators might not be part of this, but these secondary market actors are, in my view, are culpable too, because they had to know. If they read the mortgages, they read the documentation, they had to say, wait a minute, something's funny here. We got a 72-year-old retired widow with a stated income of $160,000 a year or $500,000 a year, or, you know, I mean, it just doesn't make sense that there'd be that many widows earning that kind of income. Now, there might be some who have that kind of wealth, but that kind of income when they're in their retirement years?
You know what it's like?
There's got to be something fishy here.
It reminds me of baseball. Okay, you got some players out there on the field, and they're saying, well, you got to hold the shortstop accountable for a little bit of what he did when he's out there on the field. But you got the team coach sitting in the dugout, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They haven't touched the coach. They haven't even touched all the players yet. And they sure haven't seen the one that's calling the plays. And so what they're dealing with here are some of the mortgages in the secondary market. They haven't touched the coaches. They haven't touched the originators of the mortgages in this particular settlement. Now, in terms, you said, how much does it help? The whole to our economy is several $1 trillion, counting unemployment and lost revenues and so forth. Overall, the TARP was $700 billion. I didn't support it. This settlement is maybe $25 billion. Ohio alone had a gap about that large. So when you look at the settlement, it's important. It's a victory. It's a victory.
We're going to claim it.
We got to take the next step. We got to get the first baseman, the third baseman, the catcher, the batter, and then we got to go after the coaches in the dugout.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned the S&L crisis. In the S&L crisis, we had 1,000 Justice Department lawyers going after this thing. We got 50 Justice Department lawyers going after this recent housing foreclosure crisis. I mean, can we even compete with some of these titans who the Justice Department has to deal with that small number?
I'll tell you, Congressman, one thing we need to do is look at some of the people that sit over at the Justice Department and where they used to work before they got there. Because I think one of the reasons that prosecution isn't occurring at the level that it should is that there's some paralysis in some places because of those who are able to block a play. They're able to block prosecution. We have a bill, H.R. 3050, the Financial Crisis Criminal Investigation Act, that would authorize an additional 1,000 FBI agents. That's just as many as we had during the S&L crisis, which is much smaller than what we have today. But across our cities, across our regions, we don't have the agents in place to go after the crimes we've been talking about.
Now, I just want to ask you this, gentlelady from Ohio. We've talked about who lost. Homeowners lost. Even homeowners who never lost their home in foreclosure and never missed a payment, their home value dropped. A lot of people lost. But did some people really make a lot of money off of this crisis?
Oh, they made the highest salaries in the country.
Bonuses?
They took bonuses. We didn't take a penny away. I had a bill to take 100% of the bonuses away. Guess what? They'd never bring it on the floor. We couldn't even take the bonuses away, much less their yachts, their 7 houses, all the fancy cars. They are living a great life. They're living, and they believe they are immune from prosecution, that the American people won't.
So far, they're right.
It's not a pretty picture.
But gentlelady, as some people, and many people suffered in this foreclosure crisis, it's also cities suffered, as cities were required to. They used to have a tax-paying citizen in a home. Now, after the foreclosure, with all the stated income and the dishonesty and everything, they have no one living there. They have weeds growing, dead dogs there. They have an attractive nuisance where, you know, sometimes awful things happen in those abandoned houses.
That's right.
Cities have seen their coffers drain. They went from a plus property tax paying person to now an expense on the tax rolls. We've seen a reduction in the overall property tax revenue of cities, which they need to put on vital services for residents of cities, streets, cops, fire, all that stuff.
Absolutely. In the school districts, Congressman Ellison, when you look at the revenues that are bleeding away from school districts, the harm these big banks did, and they used to be speculation houses, then they changed their name to banks.
Right. Yeah, they got to be holding bank
they got to be holy banks then.
Yeah.
But if you look at the harm that they caused across America, it's still not over, and they're not being held accountable. Actually, they got richer as a result of this crisis. 6 banks now control 2/3 of the finances of this country. 6 banks. Before the crisis, they controlled about 40%. So they just got bigger and more powerful, while community after community has been struck with more homelessness, with declining revenues to school systems, declining revenues into coffers, so they can't hire police. The drug trade is just locked down in some of these communities as people struggle to earn their way forward in a most unfortunate way. You know, you look at the harm this has caused around the country. It's profound. And they're not, I gave a special order the other day, and I said, I think what we ought to do with these big bankers, places like Goldman Sachs and Citigroup, they ought to come to our homeless shelters and scrub the floors. Once we get them prosecuted, and I wait for that day, wouldn't it be great if the CEO of Goldman Sachs had to come to a homeless shelter in Minneapolis and scrub the floors and join Habitat for Humanity for a couple years and go try to fix up some of these houses in these communities? They haven't confronted their damage. They feel they're being held harmless, and you know what? They are.
Well, to gentlelady with Yield, I mean, what happens, I mean, they profit from this mortgage fraud. They make exorbitant monies as they, you know, securitize these bad mortgages. They make exorbitant money as they collected on these credit default swaps as these mortgage-backed securities went bad. And various people made goob gobs of money, bonuses that just boggle the mind how big they are. And then, but see, what your point is interesting, because they don't see the damage that they cause, because they have some of them even helicopter from their homes to their offices. Others of them are in limousines just flying down the highway back to their country villa from their downtown Manhattan skyscraper. And, you know, and so they don't see the damage. They don't drive through Cleveland and Detroit and Minneapolis and other places where whole neighborhoods have been sucked out because of the damaging behavior that they engaged in. And I think that it would be important to, after they serve their jail time, to come and be with the people who they harmed and have to explain that, you know, the reason that we have created and exacerbated homelessness is because we just love money that much. Yeah. And having 2 or 3 yachts and a couple of boats wasn't good enough. We needed more and more and more. And that's why we wrecked your city, damaged your neighborhood, and put you out of your home.
What they have done are capital crimes. They have harmed our republic so much with this massive transfer of wealth. I think the best thing the American people can do is, if they are paying a mortgage loan or a car loan or a student loan to any one of these big institutions that harmed America, take it out, renegotiate that loan with a local institution, credit union, community bank that didn't do this harm to the republic. That's something every American family can do. And then when you think about it, what this group of bankers did, and I call them speculators because they really weren't prudent bankers.
Yeah,
what
bankers collect deposits and loan money to the communities they represent and
prudently
help people do what they need to do.
What this group did was they actually have threatened the entire system of capital formation in this country because they have disrupted the measurement of value at the local parcel level. So our normal system of recording deeds and value in Minnesota, in Ohio, was thrown out the window as they went to the MERS system, the electronic registration system, and they went over the heads of all of our local property recording offices, our titling offices. That is at the heart of capitalism itself. You would think there would be a roar out of other economic interests in this country saying, hey, you fellas, you almost brought down capitalism. You almost brought down the whole market economy. And they actually did. If you see the damage still rippling through this country, and yet they're not being prosecuted, think about that.
Yeah, well, I tell you, the gentlelady with yield, I mean, it's all sort of an interlocking mess. I mean, we've been told since the days that Milton Friedman first hit the scene that regulations were a problem in our economy, and that having rules to protect health and safety and fairness simply were disrupting the market, and we needed to get rid of these job-killing regulations, what our Republican friends call them all the time, rather than common sense protections to protect people. So we got rid of those things. We didn't enforce the laws that we already did have. We shrank government to the point where, because we didn't want to pay any taxes, we shrank government to the point where government couldn't even afford itself, so we didn't have the people to make sure that consumers were being treated fairly, that mortgages were fair, and that rules were being abided by. And then, as the technology and everything changed, we weren't able to change regulation, so it would keep up to date with the necessity of the market. What I have in mind now is a heroic figure named Brooks Lee Bourne, who tried to tell him that this opaque, insurance, I put it insurance in quotes, market, credit default swap market that needed to be regulated. Instead of regulating it, we actually passed a bill in 1999 that it would not be regulated. And then, as a result, when the music stopped in 2008, we were at the mercy of what, $54 trillion
worth. And if the gentleman will yield on that point, when that bill was passed, I would venture to say 99% of members of Congress didn't even know it was in there because it was buried in an omnibus appropriation bill. Nobody even knew it was in there. So that was sort of the final straw that broke the camel's back. And I wanted to say to the gentleman, I'm sure in Minnesota, verify this for me, like Ohio, business after business tells me, Marcy, we can't get a loan. The normal banking system isn't working, and what they're trying to do at the federal level is focus attention just on the secondary market activity rather than the loan originators. So they're saying, oh, the problem was at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were second in line.
Right.
First in line were the originators, the very institutions we're talking about here. Citicorp, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs is now involved in that, Wells Fargo, HSBC, UBS, all these institutions. And they originated through their intermediaries, like Countrywide was involved, then when the loan was made, the bad loan was made, then they sold it to the secondary market. So now most of the prosecution has been of the secondary market activities, which really soured about 2007, 2008. But the real perpetrators started well over a decade earlier. That's where we need to go.
Yeah.
To the originators, who created the schemes that allowed, as you say, the lid to be blown off the regulation of derivatives and of these fancy schemes. Right now, yes, we're trying to get a hold of the secondary market activity, but they only receive the ball from the original passer. I call them the coach, the ones that were actually developing the game plan. We have to go back